I live alone in a small cabin deep in the forest. Not the kind of place people visit by accident. The nearest town is far enough that I don't hear traffic, sirens, or voices. Only wind, animals, and the sounds the forest makes when no one is trying to listen. I moved here on purpose. I wanted quiet, routine, predictability. After a few years, you start noticing patterns most people never do. You learn which birds sing in the morning and which ones stay quiet. You learn how deer move through the trees, how they pause, how they react to sound. You learn what is normal. That's why I noticed it immediately. Animals pass near my cabin all the time. Deer are the most common, usually in small groups. They come, graze, and leave without ever getting too close. They don't stare. They don't linger. They don't watch. Until that morning, when Monmon saw them from the window while making coffee. 4 deer, standing near the tree line. 3 of them were eating, moving slowly, exactly the way deer always do. The 4th one stood slightly apart. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals separate from the group all the time. But something about the way it stood felt wrong. It wasn't stiff. It wasn't injured. It was still in a way that didn't match the others. When I stepped closer to the window, the 3 deer reacted immediately. Their heads snapped up, their bodies tensed. The 4th one didn't move. It stayed exactly where it was. I watched it for several seconds. Then it turned its head toward me. Not quickly. Not suddenly. Slowly. And the moment our eyes met, it looked away. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. Animals don't do that. They either stare until they run, or they run the moment they notice you. They don't acknowledge you, and then pretend they didn't. I told myself I was overthinking it. Living alone does that to you. You start reading meaning into small things. By the time I finished my coffee, the deer were gone. All of them. The next few days were normal. Birds in the morning, wind at night. No strange sounds. Then I saw the deer again. Same place, same distance. This time there were only 3. 2 of them behaved normally. The 3rd one stood apart. It wasn't necessarily the same deer. I couldn't tell them apart that easily. But the behavior was identical. Standing slightly away from the others, facing my cabin, watching. I didn't move. I waited. After a while, the other 2 deer wandered off into the trees. The 3rd one stayed. It didn't follow them. It didn't panic. It just stood there, staring at the place where my window was. When I shifted my weight, the deer's head tilted slightly, not toward the sound, toward me. Then, once again, it looked away, as if it had made a mistake. I stopped telling myself it was nothing. I started paying attention. I began noticing the timing. The deer only appeared when I was awake, never when I was asleep, never at night. It never approached the cabin. But every day it was closer. Not by much. Just enough to notice if you were measuring. After the first snowfall, everything became clearer. Tracks tell you things you can't see with your eyes. I went outside early that morning and saw the marks in the snow. Several sets of deer tracks, exactly what I expected. Except one. One set was different. The spacing between the prints was too even, too consistent. Real animals adjust constantly. They slip, correct, change speed. These didn't. They looked practiced. I followed the tracks for a short distance. They led toward the tree line, then curved around a fallen log. That part wasn't strange. What was strange was how closely they mirrored my usual path. The same bend, the same narrow gap between trees I used, the same spot where I usually stopped to rest. I stopped walking. The tracks didn't. They continued forward for a few more steps, then stopped, as if whatever made them had paused when I did. I went back to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep well. The deer appeared again the next morning, closer than before. This time, I didn't look away. Neither did it. We stood there, staring at each other across the clearing. It didn't blink. Its chest moved slightly, but not like an animal breathing. More controlled, measured. After several seconds, it took one step forward. Only one. Then it stopped. I closed the curtains. From that day on, the forest felt different. Quieter. Not empty. Aware. After that morning, I changed my routine. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to understand what I was seeing. I stopped standing by the window. I stopped reacting when the deer appeared. If it was watching me, I wanted to see what it did when I acted like I didn't notice. For 2 days, nothing happened. No deer near the clearing. No tracks near the cabin. The forest felt normal again. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt deliberate. On the third morning, I found tracks closer to the cabin than I had ever seen before. They weren't leading toward it. They weren't leading away. They formed a slow arc around the clearing, keeping a consistent distance from the walls, almost like something was circling. I followed the tracks for a few minutes. They stopped near a group of trees where the ground dipped slightly. There were no signs of bedding, no disturbance, just tracks that ended cleanly, as if the animal had simply decided to stop leaving marks. Later that afternoon, I saw the deer again. Only one. Standing at the edge of the trees. I didn't move. Neither did it. The distance between us was shorter now, but not close enough to feel threatening. I noticed something I hadn't before. Its head was tilted slightly, not in curiosity, but as if it was aligning its view. Adjusting. I stepped to the left. The deer didn't react immediately. Then, after a brief pause, it shifted its weight and stepped sideways. Not away. Parallel. Matching the movement. I stopped testing it after that. That night, I heard movement outside. Not footsteps. Not branches breaking. Just a steady pressure on the ground. Too slow to be a deer running. Too heavy to be small animals. I stayed in bed. The sound passed the cabin and faded into the trees. The next morning, the tracks were everywhere. Not chaotic. Not scattered. Organized. They crisscrossed paths I had walked dozens of times. They paused where I usually paused. They followed the same narrow routes I had carved into the underbrush over the years. It wasn't copying where deer would go. It was copying where I went. I tried something different. I walked a route I had never taken before, straight into thicker forest. No trail, no clear path. I circled back toward the cabin using a wide loop. When I reached the clearing, I looked down. There were 2 sets of tracks. Mine and another. They weren't identical, but they weren't random either. The spacing between steps was closer now, more deliberate, less like an animal. That afternoon, I noticed something else. The other animals were gone. No birds. No small movement in the trees. Just silence. And one deer. standing closer than it ever had before. I studied it carefully. Its body looked right. Its legs were straight. Its fur moved with the wind. But the way it balanced its weight was wrong. It stood too evenly. Real animals shift constantly. This one didn't. I stepped forward. It didn't retreat. I stopped. It stopped. For a moment, we were both completely still. Then it turned its head. Not to flee. No, not to watch the trees. To look directly behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. There was nothing there. When I looked back at the deer, it was already looking at me again. That night, I locked the door. I hadn't done that in years. The next morning, the tracks reached the cabin. They circled it once, then stopped directly in front of the door. I didn't go outside. I waited. Hours passed. Nothing touched the door. Nothing scratched or tested it. Eventually, the tracks continued away from the cabin, toward the forest. But they didn't look like they were leaving. They looked like they were practicing. That afternoon, I saw the deer one last time. It stood close enough now that I could see the details in its eyes. They didn't reflect light the way I expected. They absorbed it. The deer took one step forward, then another, then stopped. Not because it was afraid, but because it had reached a distance where it didn't need to pretend anymore. I went back inside. I didn't look out the window again that day. That night, I heard something new. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Moving around the cabin the same way I had walked earlier that morning. After that night, I stopped assuming anything was accidental. The sounds around the cabin were no longer random. They followed timing. They followed patterns. The problem was that some of those patterns were mine. I didn't leave the cabin the next morning. I stayed inside and watched through the window. The clearing was empty. No deer. No movement. But the silence felt intentional, as if the forest was waiting for something specific to happen. By midday, I decided to go outside. Not far, just enough to confirm what I already suspected. The tracks were still there, not fresh, not melting. They led around the cabin, then stopped in the same place they had the day before, directly in front of the door. I compared them to my own footprints from earlier that week. Different shape, different depth. But the spacing between steps was closer than before. Uncomfortably close. I followed the tracks again, but this time I didn't focus on where they went. I focused on how they moved. They didn't hesitate. They didn't wander. Each step landed where the next step was expected to be, not like an animal reacting to terrain, like something following an internal model. I stopped halfway down the trail. I stood still for a full minute. When I looked down, I saw something new. Another set of tracks. Fresh. Appearing beside mine. Not overlapping. Keeping distance. Matching my paws. I went back to the cabin immediately. That afternoon, I checked my supplies. Everything was where I left it. Nothing missing. Nothing disturbed. But something felt off. I couldn't tell what. I realized later what it was. The door. I don't remember opening it that morning, but the latch was positioned the way it only was when I locked it from the outside. I spent the rest of the day inside. I didn't cook. I didn't move around much. I listened. Every sound outside came with a delay, as if it was responding to something I had already done. At dusk, I heard movement again. Not circling this time. Approaching. Stopping. Approaching again. Each step evenly spaced. Measured. I counted them. The spacing matched my own stride. The sound stopped directly in front of the door. I waited. Nothing tried to open it. Nothing tested the handle. After several minutes, the footsteps moved away, not into the forest, along the side of the cabin, toward the back, where there were no tracks before. The next morning, I found prints behind the cabin. Not deer tracks, not mine, something in between. The front portion was split, but the angle was wrong. Too straight. Too intentional. I followed those tracks a short distance before realizing they were leading somewhere familiar, to the spot where I usually chopped wood, the place where I stood still the longest, where I repeated the same motion over and over. That's when it became clear. It wasn't just copying my path, it was copying my habits. I tested it again. I walked in a tight circle in the clearing, then stopped suddenly. I waited. Several minutes passed, and then I saw the marks appear. A second circle, slightly wider, correcting itself. I stopped sleeping at night, not because I was afraid of what would happen, but because I wanted to know if anything changed when I wasn't conscious. The answer was yes. One morning, I woke up to tracks leading away from the cabin. Mine. I followed them until they stopped. There was no memory of making them. They ended at the tree line, next to another set, standing close, facing the same direction. That was the first time I considered leaving, but the thought didn't feel like my own. It felt late. That evening, the deer returned, not at the edge of the clearing. Closer. Much closer. It stood in full view of the cabin. I could see its chest rise and fall. Slow. Controlled. Its legs were positioned evenly. Too evenly. It lifted one front leg. Paused, and then placed it down carefully. Testing balance, adjusting, not feeding, not listening, practicing. I watched it until darkness fell. It didn't leave. When I finally turned away, I had the distinct feeling that it continued watching the place where I had been standing. That night, I heard footsteps inside the perimeter again. This time, they didn't stop at the door. They moved along the walls, back and forth, learning the shape of the cabin. In the morning, there were tracks on the porch. They didn't circle. They stood still, directly in front of the door. 2 sets. One facing out. One facing in. I stopped pretending that ignoring it would make it go away. Whatever was outside the cabin was no longer just observing. It was learning. So I did what made sense. I prepared. The first thing I did was set traps. Not close to the cabin. No farther out. Along the paths the tracks kept appearing on. Places where a normal animal would walk without thinking twice. I checked the traps every morning. They were never triggered. Not once. But the ground around them told a different story. The tracks stopped before each trap, not abruptly, carefully. They circled. They approached from different angles, then left, as if something had identified the danger without ever touching it. I brought out the rifle after that. I hadn't used it in years. It wasn't for hunting anymore. I kept it clean, loaded. I started locking the door every night and barring the windows from the inside. Not because I expected something to break in, because I wanted to know if it tried. The nights became longer, not quieter, just more deliberate. Footsteps still came, but now they stopped farther away, as if whatever made them was adjusting to my response. One night, I heard something different. Metal. A soft, controlled sound. I checked the traps at first light. One of them was gone. Not broken. Not sprung. Removed. The chain was still there. The stake still in the ground. Only the trap itself was missing. That was when I stopped thinking of it as an animal at all. I started looking for answers. The cabin had been here long before me. So had the books, old journals, handwritten notes, local records. Most of them were useless. Stories exaggerated by fear. Until I found one entry that didn't try to explain anything. It just described behavior. It talked about animals that watched instead of fled. Tracks that followed instead of led. Creatures that didn't hunt for food, but for patterns. It said they didn't copy shape first. They copied movement, routine, habit. It warned against trying to trap them, not because they were dangerous, but because it taught them something new. After that, the tracks changed again. They no longer avoided the traps. They passed near them, close enough to leave impressions, close enough to show intent, but still never touching. I noticed something else. The tracks around the cabin started appearing in pairs. Not mine, not fully animal. Two identical sets, walking side by side, keeping perfect spacing. One morning, I found tracks leading up to the window. They stopped there, facing inward. I checked the glass. No marks, no scratches. Just a faint, fogged outline where something had stood long enough for breath to build. I moved the furniture that day, blocked the windows completely, nailed boards across the frames. The cabin felt smaller after that. Not safer, just enclosed. That night, the footsteps returned, not circling, not pacing. They walked directly up to the wall behind my bed, stopped, waited, then repeated my own movement from earlier that evening. Step, pause, shift weight. Exactly. I didn't sleep. I stayed still. The footsteps stayed too. In the morning, I found something new. Tracks on the porch. Bare. Not hooves. Not boots. Just impressions that suggested weight without defining shape. They faced the door, then turned and walked away. I realized then that the rifle didn't matter. The traps didn't matter. The locks didn't matter. Everything I did to protect myself was being added to whatever model it was building. That afternoon, I saw the deer again, closer than ever, standing in full view of the cabin. Its posture had changed, less animal, more balanced, more deliberate. It took a step forward, then stopped. Not because it was unsure, because it had learned exactly how close it was supposed to be. After the traps and the rifle stopped meaning anything, I stopped trying to control the situation. I focused on watching, not the forest, the changes. The deer didn't come back after that. Not to the clearing, not to the tree line. For several days, I didn't see it at all. That worried me more than its presence. The sound started changing first. At night, I still heard movement, but it wasn't just footsteps anymore. There were pauses where sound should have been. Gaps, as if something was listening. One evening, while sitting inside the cabin, I heard a noise that didn't belong to the forest. Wood. Not breaking. Not scratching. So being pressed. Carefully. I didn't move. The sound stopped. Then it happened again. Same spot. Same pressure. Testing. The next morning, I found tracks closer than ever. Not circling. Not pacing. Standing still. Right outside the door. Only one set. That day, I noticed something else. The sounds around the cabin were no longer random. Birds stopped calling when I moved. Wind died down when I stood still. The forest was reacting to me. That night, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow. Measured. They stopped directly in front of the door. I waited. Nothing happened. Minutes passed. Then I heard it. A sound I recognized. My voice. Open the door. The words were flat. No inflection. No urgency. Just sound. As if someone had learned how to produce it without understanding why it was used. I didn't answer. I didn't move. There was a long pause. Then the voice spoke again. Open the door. This time, the timing was better. Closer to how I would say it. I realized then that it hadn't been watching to hunt. It had been watching to replace. The voice didn't speak again that night. But I didn't sleep. The next morning, the tracks were inside the porch, not leading up to it. Inside it. As if whatever made them had learned how to step where it wasn't supposed to be. I checked the door. It was still locked. The window glass was intact. Nothing forced. Nothing broken. That afternoon, I heard something inside the cabin. Movement. Not footsteps. The sound of weight shifting. From a place I wasn't standing. I stayed still. The sound stopped. After a moment, it repeated one of my movements from earlier. Chair scraping. Pause. Floor creak. Pause. Thump. That was when I understood. The deer was never the point. It was a draft. A practice shape. That night, the voice returned. Closer. Right outside the door. It spoke once. Clear. Accurate. Using my cadence. Open the door. I didn't respond. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. On the other side of the door, something shifted its weight. And waited. I didn't open the door. I stayed exactly where I was until morning. When the light finally came through the boarded windows, the cabin felt different. Not quieter. Occupied. I checked every room slowly. Nothing was out of place. Nothing missing. Nothing added. But the air felt disturbed, as if something had moved through it without touching anything. The tracks were gone. Not melted. Not covered. Gone. The porch was clean. The ground around the cabin was smooth. No sign that anything had stood there at all. I packed what I could carry and prepared to leave. Not to escape. To test something. I stepped outside and walked a straight line into the forest. No trails, no turns. I walked until I was sure I had gone farther than I ever had before. Then I stopped. I waited. When I looked down, there were two sets of tracks, mine and another. They stood side by side, identical spacing, identical pauses. I walked again. The second set followed, not behind, beside. I turned suddenly. There was nothing there. But when I looked down again, the tracks had adjusted, corrected. I went back to the cabin, not because I wanted to, but because both sets of tracks did. Inside, I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the chairs was slightly out of place, but just enough to notice if you knew where it always stood. I moved it back. Later, it was wrong again. That night, I stayed awake. I didn't hear footsteps. I heard breathing. Not heavy, not panicked, practiced. At some point, I realized I was hearing it from two places at once. I checked the door, still locked. I checked the windows, still barred. Nothing had entered. Nothing had needed to. The voice didn't come from outside this time. It came from behind the wall, from inside the cabin, from the space between rooms. Open the door. The words were perfect now, not copied, remembered. I spoke out loud for the first time in days. I can hear you. The cabin stayed silent. Then I heard my voice again. From somewhere I wasn't standing. I know. I stopped speaking. I sat down. I waited. At some point during the night, I stood up. I don't remember doing it. In the morning, I found tracks on the floor. Not impressions, not marks, just subtle shifts in dust that showed where weight had been placed. 2 paths, both starting from my bed. I checked the door again. It was unlocked. I don't remember unlocking it. Outside, the forest looked normal. Birds returned. Wind moved through the trees. Everything behaved the way it was supposed to. I walked away from the cabin. Only one set of tracks followed me. I don't know if I left alone. I don't know if it needed the deer anymore. I don't know if it needed the cabin. I know this. When I reached the edge of the forest and looked back one last time, I saw someone standing near the tree line, not watching the cabin, watching me, standing the way I stand, waiting the way I wait. I didn't turn around again. If you ever find tracks that follow your habits instead of your path, if something watches without reacting, if it learns before it moves, don't listen when it asks you to open the door, because at that point, it's not trying to get inside. It's checking whether there's still a difference between you and it.